I'm Lee. I have a user handle Polymetus if you've seen me floating around in IRC and all that. Although I have discovered lately that my actual name is more unique than my handle. So if you look for Lee and then a long Greek name, you'll find me. So I'm just going to give a little background on designing with Elixir. And I'm using the term design mildly unorthodox, but that's entirely because I come from a front-end tradition, and we didn't talk about architecture when designing a magazine ad or something to that effect. So for the last few months, by few months, it's longer than I thought, about 9 months, I've been working with my business partner on building a new CI system that will be open sourced as more of like a Jenkins replacement that's actually built on Elixir and some FreeBSD stuff. It will support other VMs if you're curious. But the origin of this is Dave and I were working on a project, Dave being Dave Cottle-Huber, DCH in IRC land. We were working on a project and we were asked to boot up Jenkins for the umpteenth time. I had been working with Jenkins for about 7 years, Dave longer, and Jenkins is very good for Java projects, which seems to be most of the world, but for other languages, it seems to be working uphill to make your language appear more like Java, which, to be honest, I went to Erlang to avoid Java at all costs. So we were not thrilled. But there wasn't really a lot of good open source replacements for Jenkins. It was just, there's a lot of people building and building and building on top of Jenkins. So we decided to just build our own for the particular case. And now we're building a more generic style product for that. And we like Elixir and Erlang for this is because it does map very, very well to a CI system because of the componentization, the supervisor trees, and all of that. A lot of the design problems of a CI are already solved. Sorry, it's a little hot up here. But after a point, there's one actual problem between Dave and myself working together. I live in Vancouver, Canada. He lives in Vienna. There's not a huge amount of time overlap. So we can't just pair all day and all night because we like sleeping, having families, eating, doing things. So we do have overlap and we do try to hand off properly. But we had a new problem, which was basically we had to hand off with effective communication, which isn't necessarily verbose communication because you're wasting the few hours you have to pair. So I started thinking about, in the old days when I used to work at kind of a busy ad agency, of how we used to communicate and design our specs before taking stuff to the client. So I've started applying these to our own projects and I'm just bringing in some of the wisdom. So for people that are curious, about half this talk is going to be abstract, and then the other half will be serious code and how you hang these into the abstract concepts. So it will help you complete the steps. But the first thing is, I've taken this idea a little bit from what my old creative director used to tell me about the Kind of Blue album. So just from show of hands, how many people have listened to this album before? All right, so many. All right, so it's, for those that haven't, it's considered one of the best jazz albums ever, certainly the 20th century. But there's an interesting factoids about its composition, which is the fact is it's not composed. Like it's been written down now, but not while they were recording. And it was based on this idea of modal jazz, which is you don't focus on melody, you focus on tone and design restrictions. As my creative director used to tell me, good art comes from restrictions, not freedom. I'm a little more even, but this was the phrase. So how that was recorded, it was recorded over 2 days, one in March and one in April. The musicians were not given any melodies or sheet music. They were given ideas of what they could not do, and usually the first instrument would be composed of a few chords, and then the the musicians would play off each other. So it's kind of an improvisational album. And it was relatively minimum input from Miles Davis other than to break the concept of bebop. Now, this is important because it left room for interpretation of each performer on the album. So it's not a pure Miles Davis album, it's every contributor. Furthermore, if you can get your hands on a Super Audio CD or find me around in the hallways, because I have a copy on me, Flamenco Sketches has 2 takes on it. And it's interesting in the sense that they are very similar songs. Like, if you listen to them far enough apart, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But if you listen to them back to back, you will hear definitely flourishes and parts of the song that are quite different, despite the fact the tone is the same. I do think the original version that was released is better, but it allows you to conceptualize what is going on amongst the musicians. They're playing off each other live as the recording is going on. And don't get me wrong, it's 2 days to produce a 45-minute album. So you're talking about many, many takes. So it's not free, it's just works. So from that, I've been designing systems that we figure out the restrictions to pass to each other, and then we develop a system so that even though I might be away, I'm not breaking anything of Dave's, and vice versa. When he produces something, it's kind of what I'm expecting, and we can riff off each other, even though it's an asynchronous workflow. So in that, I'm actually now going to just go into the particulars of what we used to do at an ad agency when somebody would come in. And so we had this idea of a Notion cloud. I think that's what we called it. It might have another name, which was more or less a brainstorming session. So I've stolen this from Goat user stories. So you just come up with the idea of who your target demographic was, and then you would describe your ideas of what their requirements might be, or what would work with them, or even things that might be outside your scope, but they might be dealing with that you might be able to address. And like, in this case, this is the lowest amount of time commitment to design out. It's at most 30 minutes. You can do it in a very quick call. You just come up with all the ideas about the particular business problem that you're dealing with. And it's quite important that it's not only users. I might be a little more user-focused, but it could be the requirements of a database. This Goat could be Postgres. Postgres has certain requirements to make our app go fast or whatever, and you just keep writing them down. And then when you wake up in the morning, or you have a nice list of demands that you're trying to satisfy. And this is fairly simple. Again, so stage 1. Now, stage 2, so this is called the Dependency Graph. We've all seen them before, but I've been watching this YouTube series called Boss Keys by Mark Brown on the channel Game Maker's Toolkit. And video games are basically one large UI layer. Like, there's not a lot about the performance underneath, but it's a character interaction that you teach the player how to interact with the world, and then they immediately take those lessons to solve puzzles. Now, we don't want to solve puzzles per se, but the way of graphing out a video game is no different than a normal workflow. So I've been using this, and I'll give you a couple examples actually. So here. So in the case of, this is Super Metroid, and this is the entire game. The red line represents a certain stage in the game, but this is a very abstract mapping of basically everything you can do in that video game, where every item is, all that. You can do this with any application. And in this version, and I know this is quite complicated, but in this, you can actually run tests on whether or not there are parts of your application that are inaccessible. Because as long as you have a complete dependency graph, and in the sense of Elixir or Erlang, or even just your JavaScript UI layer, you can actually build out tests that map to this. But if you draw this out, everyone has a record of what you're intending to do. And don't get me wrong, like, we change these things. Now, just for a less complicated one, this is simpler. This is from Wind Waker, and this is one dungeon. You can consider this a workflow with exits. So in this case, it's you enter into the level. You need to find the key on the right in order to get through the central doorway. Then you need the boomerang to get to the hanging flower, which gets you another key. And then you go use the big key, and then you go fight the boss. But if you see the little yellow line, that's an exit to speed up looping through the dungeon. And this is how good UI works. I can't count the number of times I've been trapped in a part of a UI layer where I had to back out several times in order to get where I was going. And video games are very good at trying not to waste players' time to get through the game, because wasted time feels bad. And it feels bad in UI design. But I would recommend taking a look at these YouTube videos, because they do teach you a different way of thinking about your application. And this is fairly distilled down, so you don't necessarily have to play the game, but if you have played said game, it gives you a different eye viewpoint. This takes a lot more time to architect for your app, but at the same time, it's very easy to modify later, because you're not committed to anything other than making sure that the dependency tree works. So there's that. Now, this is the last bit, so I'm just going to speed through that a little bit. But, So storyboards. So storyboards are, I think they were developed by Disney, but don't quote me on that, to test out what an animation would look and feel like, and time positioning without spending all the animation hours, sorry, I almost said developer hours, animation hours to fully animate it in order to see how people would react to it. In our case, as developers, it costs a lot of time, but it's very useful to, for what I would consider a high-value workflow, to articulate it as well as possible, so that everyone on board, as you keep improving upon it, knows exactly what's going on and how it's working. Now, I have an example here, which is actually a developer comic, but this is essentially nothing more like, this is kind of like RabbitMQ and subscribing. It's done in the sense of Batman, but basically we have Batman wants to subscribe to an event of the Joker doing something. Message shows up on the message queue. It's probably the Joker. Batman gets a push notification, goes off and does a thing. Like gets off in the Batmobile. Now, this is a lot of work for a simple message queue analogy, but this goes for any part of your application. It's simple. Everyone can understand it. It's very easy to onboard new people to the project. It's clear to anyone that hasn't seen an event engine before. And I quite like this, but it does cost a bit of time. Now, it doesn't have to look as good as this. Like most of my storyboards are stick figures. But yeah, that's it. So if you do want to learn more about storyboarding, because there's a bit of time investment in learning how to step through your project that way, I recommend this little course that Rachel Neighbors does. It takes about a weekend if you got free time. And also for anyone interested, I'm going to be putting my notes on GitHub and on the Koan CI org. So, but you can do this. I think it's like $100. It's a weekend. She provides feedback. You draw some things, and you'll be able to, well, you'll be more in tune with what storyboarding is. I don't have time for a workshop. So anyways, those are the three major techniques. And again, I do break them down literally in that order. I think the dependency graph is super important, but costs some time. The Notion cloud is the cheapest way to just talk about a problem and leave an appropriate artifact after the meeting. And then storyboarding is usually, I'm either doing something very complex or high value, and I need clear documentation as to what's going on. So that's it. That's the abstract area. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a more concrete way at Koan's, what we're doing at Koan CI with some code, and how that hinges into why this is a good idea to do in Elixir. So again, stick figure. So this is part of our user login and sign up system. And the initial thing is I drew a developer, and I started working with thinking about what her needs are for a CI, and also what it's like to sign up, log in, and do that. So in all of this, like, not all of it is actionable. Like, I am part of a community. It's not an actionable item in and of itself, but it may lead to somewhere, particularly in a CI with some sort of social aspect, because you have to acknowledge her place in the community, and then also acknowledge how to connect that community in not necessarily a correct way, but at least in a way that makes sense. They want to be able to work the way they would like to work, which I've coded in here as I want to be who I am. They want work-life balance, which means your CI should be fast, but it should also respect work-life boundaries. Like, shouldn't be sending notifications in the middle of the night if they have a snooze button, or you develop a snooze button. And you also, in this case, these are all the wants, her wants as a developer. But in the reality of things, like, you have to address those in multiple ways through dialogue. You have to be explicit about what you're doing. So again, this doesn't take very long, but it's just an example to go through the ideas of how you're conceptualizing a user. And more importantly, as you start having users come to your system, you're going to be modifying this all the time. You're going to go through your support queue. You're going to see obvious not failures, but obvious weak points in your application. And then you're going to see how to modify this notion board, and then possibly have to go further down into your dependency trees or storyboards. So the next one is, this is the dependency graph similar to what I was showing you earlier with Super Metroid and Wind Waker. Now, I've done this in a way that we have a logged out user. They can see open source builds and read site literature. If they log in with the key, then we start having more features hinged into that section. And you want so an example here, and there should be an extra line, but I'm not that great at PowerPoint. So converse with others and can view open source builds should be connected, but they can only, after logging in, to authenticate who they are and how they've dealt with the community before, talk to people on other open source builds in order to so yeah, again, this is dependency tree, so you know you haven't locked out the site, but you're protecting the community, you're protecting the person's sense of identity, which is important when you have a community-driven site. Like, everyone needs to be recognized as who they are and not be hacked, spoofed, or anything. Inside that key and box, I have another, this is kind of dependency graph, but it's more process. So, or it's more a definition of what the key is. So we have a key, we have a developer, we have to match against a database record, access personal data, and then the authentic you, the authenticated you, really. So in this case, what I was saying earlier, where it's not always a user we're talking about. At Koan CI, we use a database called CouchDB. So the match against a database record actually has two users. It has you entering in your password and all of that, but also satisfying the needs of the database. In our particular case, we're using CouchDB's internal user database, so to authenticate users. So there's some semantic meaning to the user's login inside the database, and we do that for security, because in CouchDB, you can have multiple databases, and users can have access to like one or two and all that. So we have a second layer to prevent bleeds of information to outside sources. So we don't entirely only rely on the authorization layer. We also rely on the database rejecting requests by creating that. So I'm not going to bore you with the couch version of the notion, but you can literally sit down and put CouchDB in the center and say, here are the requirements that CouchDB wants for this. So, this is just some annoyances. So everyone always asks me, what is the typeface that I'm using in my code examples? It's called operator mono. Please feel free, go download it, it's great. But that's what it is. Last talk I gave, most of my questions were, where's the font and how do I get it? The other thing is Dave and I are both a little old-fashioned. Dave's been doing Erlang for very long, I think over 10 years, and I've been doing Erlang and Elixir for, I think, 6 now. So we have some crotchetiness to how we design our applications. So Dave used to go by the handle on Twitter, deprecated Biff. So we have some old habits, and feel free to argue, but this is just kind of how we think about the problem. So anyway, so I'm going to start with module design. This is actually an older version. This is actually the first draft of the API I'm satisfying to both check passwords and store it. This is not what we're using right now, and there's some cruft, but I'll get into this. So, oh, sorry. And I have it right in front of me, so I apologize. So in a module, so we've all designed gen servers before. Like there's a public interface and a private interface. And we have the same option. In Erlang, it's very obvious that you only export certain functions. In Elixir, it is obvious, but you have to opt into the private functions, so with defp. So in my opinion, and probably Dave's, it's very important to have a very clear public interface to your module that you don't change that much. And then you can do whatever you want in the private modules to support that. And we do this very explicitly for a few reasons, one of which is writing tests become a lot easier because your module has very clear open functions that you can, I very commonly return fake data when I first start designing a module that will pass the test, and then I start breaking the test in order to fill it to the actual endpoint. And the other reason is if you use recon in production, putting a recon tracer directly on the public interface modules, it makes it much easier to see when bad data is coming through, when you have a bug that's live. If you have a very deep module, meaning you have many, many functions in that module, it becomes increasingly harder to find out what's going on. You can do it, it just becomes harder. So in this case, this would be the parts of the dependency tree. So there's a function here which is check password, and it does exactly what you think it does. I've cut off some of it, but basically it accepts the username and password, and then goes checks with CouchDB whether or not that's a legit username and password and says yay or nay and grabs the session data. So it, again, just takes username and password and then it has a backend to it. And then the other one is gets session from Couch. I think this function is now called get session. It takes the same information, but it's if you're not logged in Couch at all, it double checks and then grabs the session data. Now, in this case, I'm using HTTPC, and I'll explain why in a second. But this is the only public functions to this. And these names are going to sound a little familiar because it's the same API as come on in. So I could rewrap this a little bit and then make a come on in plugin for CouchDB as your provider for hashing and all of that. And again, this makes your app flexible because changing the private functions doesn't affect anyone else at the company. Your module is isolated, and this comes more or less for free in Beam language because each module is separate. Even if you hot code reload this module, you're going to be able to not affect the rest of the app. So this type of isolation is fairly unique, or at least comes easier in Elixir. Now, the reason I'm using HTTPC, and this is related to module design, is I noticed that many libraries treat deps a little bit like a junk drawer. So in a particular case, our primary HTTP client is Gun, but we only use it when we need to, because we have to shove all HTTP requests through Gun, and then in the HTTP, for something so simple, this is a very simple post request, it's useful if we ever decide to rip Gun out. Instead of making an additional abstraction layer, just use HTTPC, it's inside the VM. It's not the greatest HTTP client, I admit, but if it's simple, it gets it done, you'll never have to touch it again. You'll get soft deprecation warnings for years, it seems, and then you're done. So that's why that is. There's an active effort to simplify the stack and make sure that, I at least try to make sure that HTTP requests go through a particular library, all of them. Sometimes it's not possible, we all know that, but in an ideal world, and this again goes into module design, just try to think of each part of your app as a separate module, and if you end up in a spider web of dependency hell, that's kind of not fun in debugging. Next thing, this is more unique to Elixir, is structs and struct scoping, as I call it, which is when you just pattern match directly on structs for particular functions. So this is a concept about a couple months ago of all the data we had for a user. Now, in my case, I tend not to use just everything be nil, because I like being able to document and read what I'm kind of expecting. In this case, mainly binaries and some stuff I'm hiding by nil, but roles is a list with binaries. This is kind of poor man's type specking, but it does help when I've come back to a project in a while. So this is just, I recommend structs for basically anything you're persisting to, either a database, a gen server, or whatever. This is a very early draft of something hand-coded that is very similar to how Ecto does with macros for CouchDB. Now, I cut out some bits to try to make it clearer, but it's tiny. So when we call all users, it goes to a special user database, and there are certain very special requirements with that database because it's a little fiddly. But this doesn't affect anything else when we're calling against repo all. So the user struct is passed in directly pattern matched, gives you that isolation. You can do all the special requirements, and then you get your data back to your application in exactly the way you're expecting. Comparatively to all others, the abstraction of what's going on inside Couch is transparent to anyone else working on other parts of the app. So again, if you switch things out, or even if we decide to start using Postgres, other parts of the application won't be able to tell. If you go a little further, now there's a lot of implementation here, which I don't want to get too deep into. Like, as you can see, the users that we identify as part of the application are all prefixed with org.couchdb.user. So I'm just doing that work inside this repo this repo get function. Oops, secrets. Anyway, there is a mistake in this code, which I wanted to point out, because originally I had removed design docs, which design docs in CouchDB closest analog is stored procedures in Postgres land or SQL land. And those are stored as JSON documents, or I think Erlang documents as well. And we just don't want them in the application. They have nothing to do with the application. I accidentally didn't make that a private function, so it's exposed to the world. In a good, well-designed module, they would be hidden away because it's pure implementation. There's no reason I would ever remove a design doc other than inside this module. And yeah, and that's basically it. Again, it's componentization. You're designing the outer layer of the API to be as generic as possible, and then your private functions are storing, tucking implementations away. Now, this one, because it's the elephant in the room, interface design with LiveView. So, as we all know, LiveView dropped a couple of weeks ago. It is by far the most pleasant experience I had developing highly interactive apps, including and this is the key point, a progressive upgrading application. So for people that aren't into UI that much, a progressive app is when JavaScript activates, it becomes an enhanced experience, but when JavaScript doesn't show up, for instance, bad packets, or the user just has JavaScript off, you can still do things. So in this case, I've made some minor adjustments to one of Chris's demos. So I will have this code again on GitHub. You don't need to write it down. But I've literally changed 4 lines of code. And then if we go back to our original user, Notion sphere, if they are a user with accessibility difficulty, that might have JavaScript off because some screen readers have things popping in and out of the DOM, and it's really annoying. So they just turn JavaScript off completely. With basically wrapping 2 buttons or 3 buttons in a simple GET request and put the routing in, if JavaScript is off or doesn't arrive, or takes very long time because you have a big JavaScript package and you have the full page, the user can just bypass it. You do have to make 2 extra routes. In this case, I called it def inc and def descend to match the API inside the LiveView. But that works. I left the implementation out. I made it a gen server because I was feeling lazy. But the key here is, like, when you see those ahrefs, they get ignored as soon as JavaScript turns on. So it's transparent to the user. It's literally a couple extra bytes and a little bit of extra effort. And it actually does help either your users or at least support not getting a request that your app is broken because it doesn't load. And honestly, I've never had an easier time making a progressive web app. Usually it takes me hours to design basically 2 parallel apps, and this is one place and it's done. And I would like to say thank you to Chris for developing this in such a way that it delivers useful data on first page view without waiting for JavaScript to activate. This is another thing, so then deprecated BIF warning, but debugging macros in production are hard. It just is hard. Macros are very powerful and definitely essential, but we only use them when we're obviously repeating ourselves. We don't start with the macro. We see, oh, I've written this code 12 times. I'm going to write it 12 more. Let's write a macro for it. And this is just friendly advice. Yeah, it's in the power of Elixir. It is useful, but do it when necessary. Now, I know this is a little bit like, oh, you drew a few circles, and how do I finish a full application? And it's like, well, you just finished the owl. But it's kind of true at the same time. You have to start somewhere. Generally speaking, I can't tell how you and your team will interact. I purposely changed many of our actual storyboards to have either stick figures or different design styles so that, again, it's going to be you and your team. How do you best communicate? I do think the 3 things, the storyboard versus dependency graph versus Notion cloud, all as abstract ideas work really well, but maybe you have someone on your team that really thinks really well with storyboards, and even though I think it's expensive, it might be better on your team to storyboard out. And storyboards are just like the dependency graph. Like each panel can be its own module. It has an obvious API to it, and you just hinge your code on it. And it leaves abstract documentation. And that's really it. Like, I use the carpenter idea of measure twice, cut once. It does take a little time to design or architect your app, but it saves a lot of time in the long run because many apps I've interacted with, I spend more time debugging in order to get a feature out faster, whereas having an app that is moderately designed in such a way that is designed so that you and your team can riff off each other, is more valuable in my opinion, because you get to iterate a little faster when the app starts getting complex, even though you're not to market quite as fast. And on that note, so our CI is going to have a cloud-based service, KoanCI.com. Its closed beta is launching very soon. If you use ElixirConf EU, we'll expedite your invite so that you can kick the tires. Again, this will be open sourced. It will be a similar strategy to Scenic, where we will hammer out version 1 and then we'll open source all of it. And that's it. So thank you.
Any questions? Actually, one, with my Erlang background, which, you're mentioning macros.
Yes.
And you mentioned yesterday, you can have lots of copy and paste programming, or you can insert a macro right now. You said use macros if you have a lot of repetitive code. Can't you use libraries?
You can, and well, the library probably has a macro in it at that point in Elixirland at least. And to be clear, we have a lot of libraries, which is what I was mentioning earlier when try to restrict the number of libraries to purpose, because otherwise your wow, that's a habit, observer, when you're in it, you'll see all of your applications and you'll start getting confused. So yes, I advocate use libraries, but be fastidious. Research them, know how they interact. Boot up Observer and see how your application is designed.
Anyone else?
Hi, this is more a question about Koan. How are you going to be doing the configuration for the builds? Is it going to be the typical YAML file route?
Oh, no, never YAML file. No, so we are using a language called UCL. It's based on Nginx's configuration file, except it's been pushed closer to being a proper declarative language. It's currently used by HashiCorp and I think Atlas, or no, Terraform. So if you need to see guides, they have a slightly forked version to address some things in Terraform. There is a generic language spec, which is what we're using. And I could show you an example, but I think I don't have that cloned on this particular computer, but please find me in the hallway. I'll happily show you around. You can take a YAML file and just shove it into UCL. There's a translator engine that is open source. And then you can optimize your UCL so it actually makes sense instead of sitting with a slide rule and a ruler trying to figure out where your spacing is. And we are trying to absorb Travis and Circle CI files so that it's a little easier if you're planning on converting, but at the same time, there's a lot of edge cases.
Hi. So when making storyboards or Notion clouds or these things, how close are you usually to the end user in terms of like management and support and whatever, that it's often in between you, the end user, and the developers.
So in that particular way, so what I've used before is Notion Cloud with support. I usually have support people know what the Notion Cloud is, and they can put in whatever real demands are coming out of the support queue. Then if it's a UI instance, the designers would be sitting around usually with the storyboards because they're better at drawing. But the designer will start integrating that, and then we'll give it back to support and see if that seems to map to their understanding. And then if we have users that we know are, let's say, friendly, as opposed to very cranky users, which we all have. And we all have our bad days, to be honest. I've been a cranky user as well. We start integrating it, and we even say, would this make your life better? And it's a workflow, which is not coding, but it makes sense. And also, but if it's more of a developer problem, like we're having a problem with our database, I have a Notion Cloud for CouchDB right now. And if there's a problem with the database, I start filling it out, and it's more a developer thing. But okay, this module is obviously broken in this edge case. How do we resolve it? And the important bit is that the source of truth are these abstract documents that anyone can read. It also saves on onboarding because, although it does feel a little bit like you're in primary school, it's like, here's a picture book of our application, but it's helpful. So yeah.
All right, let's hear it for Ley. Thank you.